Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale. Hello everyone and welcome back to this 51st or 50th B episode of Tales of Britain and Ireland. This episode is quite a bit different to my normal ones, so please be aware of that, because as announced last time, this episode is the very first expert discussion section, with Dr. Simon Young, who you will meet in just a moment. Now, I kind of wrote this episode sort of assuming you'd have listened to the 50th episode first, the one on Boggarts, but really, you could do it either way round. I'd probably advise you to listen to that one first, but not too strongly if you just want to get on with listening to this one. Do what you like. As well as that expert discussion section, there is a very short story section at the end of the interview which just rounds off this piece on Boggarts. I honestly don't know if I'll do more stuff like this on the podcast. It will depend, I think, entirely upon the reaction of you, the listener. So please do feedback about this episode more than you might do usually. I should probably say that this was my first time interviewing or indeed recording anything without a script, and my technique definitely needs a little work. In addition, part of the recording at my end didn't work, so I've had to re-record and it sounds a little unnatural in places. However, about 90% of the speaking is Simon's and all of his came across perfectly, but if I was to do this again, I would certainly work a little bit harder at my end. I really hope it doesn't detract from it. I don't think it does, or I wouldn't be putting this out, but I just thought I would let you know that. Simon is an incredibly knowledgeable speaker on this topic, and I really enjoyed interviewing him. And I know I've got a lot out of it, but I honestly don't know the mix of people listening for stories and for the discussion section bit of the podcast. So yeah, let me know what you think. Also, a quick reminder, if you haven't checked them out already, I have realistic pictures of Boggarts on... Realistic, what am I talking about? I have pictures of Boggarts based on folklore that are on Wikipedia or my website now, and if you haven't checked them out already, why don't you go and do that? I'm still feeling really good about having got those done, especially when I noticed they were being used in other articles on Wikipedia as well. So thank you so much for all the artists and to the patrons who helped me out with that. So without any further ado, onwards to the first Tales of Britain and Ireland expert discussion section with Dr. Simon Young on the subject of Boggarts. So, thank you very much for joining us, Simon.
Well, it's a great honour, particularly for the 50th episode.
Oh, thank you very much. Simon, I have introduced you on the previous episode as the world expert on Boggarts, but I've wondered whether you could give us maybe a bit of an overview of what it is, what you do, most of which I think will be of interest to people who listen to this podcast well outside the realm of Boggarts.
Well, I should start by saying that I probably am the world expert on Boggarts, but I'm probably also the only person with the slightest interest in Boggarts. So there's not much competition in the field, let's say. As far as my general interest, I in the last 10 years or so, I've tried very gradually to do my best to reconstruct what I think of as the lower mythology of Britain. This is the various bogies, fairies and so forth that can be found all over the island. And to do so using as much data and as much evidence as I can find, particularly from the 19th century. So I spend a lot of my days effectively in the 19th century dredging through old reports and looking for clues. And Boggarts were just part of that more general campaign.
Excellent, and you've done a fair amount of work on Boggarts now, haven't you? Published a few books and a few other bits and pieces, really.
Yeah, that's right. So a couple of years ago, I brought out a book called simply The Boggart with University of Exeter Press that looks at the folklore, the history, the place names connected with Boggarts. And at the same time, I brought out a book called The Boggart Source Book. And I'm very proud to say that that book is free of charge. and you can go to University of Exeter and just download it at will. And it's more sources than anything else, but hopefully it's something that many of your listeners would find interesting.
Absolutely, and I think every single Boggart story I told, bar one, was taken from that source book, so thank you very much for that.
Good. I'm glad it's being used.
Very much so by me, certainly. It's if I was flicking through a physical copy, it would be dog-eared by now. So Simon, listeners have probably just heard an episode where I've told those Boggart tales from those books, a selection, and there are so many that could have been told. It's only a small few. And I steadfastly refused to answer the question during that episode of what is a boggart? And I think some people, maybe not all of my international listeners, but some people will be coming to that with a very particular idea. And I know we're going to discuss this in a bit, but I thought maybe you could tell people what a boggart is, just imagining they don't come to this with any preconceived ideas, so you're not immediately having to defend yourself. What would you say a boggart is?
Okay, so a boggart is a generic name for an ambivalent or evil, solitary supernatural being. Now, that all sounds a little bit technical, but it's basically a bogey on its own, and it can be of various types, but the key thing is it's solitary and it's not a good being.
Yes, absolutely. And just, I don't want to shy away from saying the G word here, because a lot of the boggarts that in the source book, and certainly not all, seem to fall into solitary supernatural beings that are just, as we would understand it, ghosts. Is that fair enough to say?
Look, my estimate would be that of the boggarts that I've come across in my sources, I would say 70% are ghosts.
Which I think is the thing that is surprising given how boggarts are viewed today.
Yes, absolutely.
Though, as ghosts go, would it be fair to say the impression I got is that they're mostly the most mean kind of ghosts, really, aren't they?
I'm not absolutely sure that's true. I can think of some boggarts that are ghosts that aren't particularly malicious. I would say it's more that the ones that are mean are the ones that get, let's say, the best press, the one that are most likely to turn up in our sources.
Right, okay, well, guilty as charged there, I think. You use another term as well, don't you? Another Lancashire term, or refer to one that was in use, the fearing, which I particularly like, and place boggarts within that. Do you want to talk a bit more about what that means?
Right, so fearing is a Lancashire dialect term that was much used in the 19th century. And in fact, equivalents of it were used over much of England. And fearing just means frightening things. And so people would say, oh, you don't want to go out tonight because the fearing are about. And they just mean by that frightening things are about. And in different parts of England, there were slightly different words used to describe that. Now, it was used generally in Lancashire for any evil or ambivalent supernatural being. In other words, pretty much anything apart from angels. But it was actually also often applied to fairies. Whereas because boggarts are solitary, the word boggart is never or almost never applied to fairies.
So you've kind of got fairies and boggarts as two of the biggest classes of supernatural creature, and within boggarts there's a lot of overlap with what we consider to be ghosts, basically.
Yeah, I think if you imagine a sort of a family tree of the supernatural in your head, as someone in northwest England would have thought of it in the 19th century, the first division that they would have had is they would have had good and evil. And good supernatural beings, for a good Christian anyway, would be beings like angels, creatures that are close to God. On the other side, you have the evil and the ambivalent spirits, and those break down into two parts. There are the fairy folk on the one hand, that are social, they have their own society, and then there are the various solitary beings. And basically, boggart was applied to any of the solitary beings. So I'll give you an example of one that many of your listeners will have heard of, Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth was typically called a boggart.
Kind of true to say that there's a classification issue here, that the current classifications that we use don't really apply at the time that we're talking about, which When is the time we're talking about, and where? I think is also the other question lead on. A bit of a double question, that one.
Right. So, as far as where, we know that boggart is used over most of northwestern England. So, let's say Lancashire, going down into South Cheshire, Derbyshire, even parts of Nottinghamshire, and then also the West Riding, so what is today West Yorkshire. And then actually, you have a strand of the use of boggart going all the way across through Nottinghamshire and into northern Lincolnshire. So mostly it's the northwest, but you also get little bits in the Midlands and the northeast. As far as the dates go, the earliest references that we have to the word boggart comes from the 1500s in roughly that area. And of course, the word is used in the traditional sense all the way down through the 19th century. And one of the things that surprised me in my research is that there are pockets in Lancashire and Derbyshire still today where people use boggart in the old traditional sense. And like you say, there is a classification problem here because most people who come to boggarts don't think of boggarts in the way I've just described them to you.
Yep, go on. Let's talk a bit about that then. So when you say that, why is that?
This is the problem that hangs over this whole debate. So essentially, what happens is this, that if you go to a modern fairy dictionary, and perhaps the best, certainly the most influential example of this is Catherine Briggs's wonderful Dictionary of Fairies, she treats boggarts in the same way that you would treat other supernatural beings like, I don't know, Padfoot or Jenny Greenteeth. And the problem with doing this is she doesn't recognise, and she didn't know, I think, that boggart is a different kind of classification. It's a little bit like if a Martian comes to planet Earth to examine flying creatures and goes back to Mars after a couple of years of research and says, well, I can give you three names. There are robins, there are eagles, and there are birds. In other words, robins and eagles are species. We can live with this. But bird is this general classification. And this is what boggart meant for people in the 19th century. Now, where did it all start to change? Well, what happened was essentially a couple of writers in the 19th century began to tell one particular boggart story. And this is the story that became the most famous boggart story of all. And it's about a boggart that lives with a family that is a house spirit. And this house spirit pesters the family, and you certainly will know this story, and I suspect most of your listeners will. At a certain point, the family decides to scramble, to get out, to leave the house. They pack up all their stuff very early one morning, and they're heading off down the road, and they're stopped by a neighbour, and the neighbour says, oh, where you going? And a little voice pipes up from the cart and says, oh, we're flitting. That is, we're moving house. The point is, the boggart is coming with them. And it's a beautiful story. But as the word boggart shrank, as it started to disappear from main discourse, that story survived. And so people made the mistake of thinking, oh, okay, well, a boggart is what we read about in that story. Therefore, a boggart is a house spirit. And this was then pushed along by various people with and without agendas. Perhaps the most interesting of these was Baden-Powell, the founder of the Cub Scout movement. Baden-Powell also founded the Brownies. And the Brownies was based on a Victorian short story about how you have good children who are called brownies and bad children called boggarts. And young guides and brownies often played games involving this malicious spirit called the boggart. And so right there through the early 20th century, you have this reinforcement, and then comes along one of the great saviours of British folklore in many ways, Catherine Briggs. And Catherine Briggs just hammers away at this idea that the boggart is a house spirit.
And it is really completely transformed, isn't it, by the idea that most people have now is so different from what it was in the 19th century in the areas that people talked about boggarts.
Yeah, I mean, if you could bring a Lancashire lad from 1850 and introduce him to the boggart we have today, what we think of as the boggart, I suppose that he would be able to accept what he saw as a boggart, but he would say, but hold on, also that's a boggart, a ghost is a boggart, a will-o'-the-wisp is a boggart, an undine in a pool waiting to drown and kill someone is a boggart. So in this way, for him, boggart was much, much broader. And I should put in a word of defence, I suppose, here for those who've carried and changed the meaning of the word boggart. It's normal that supernatural names change their meaning. This happens all the time. If we look at what we mean by fairy today and look at what people meant in 1600, the word has changed almost out of recognition. So it happens, and probably in some sense, it's a sign of cultural good health that words change their meanings, that they don't ossify, in other words. But we should also acknowledge that when we talk about boggarts today, we're talking about a different kind of folklore label from the one that was used with such enthusiasm back in the 1800s, say.
Yeah, and I think actually reading about it and thinking about ghosts is another one where, while a ghost even is something similar today, and they've got the spirit of a dead person, they're still very different, the ghosts that we see in medieval texts and the ghosts that we see in the 19th century. And what I think of, like, the stories of boggarts that are the giant sheep and giant geese and fiery wheels and all these strange ghosts that I think people accepted as ghosts, some of my absolute favourites, that you just wouldn't get a ghost story like that today. It's just not going to happen, is it?
Yeah. It's when I think about ghosts today, I sometimes sin in this way. I think of just ghosts, and I think about some poor lonely old spirit dressed in grey on her endless loop in a pub corridor going round and around. And the thing is that when you go back to the 19th century, they did have ghosts like that, but they also had far more colourful types of ghosts, almost baroque ghosts sometimes. And I agree completely, Graham, with you that maybe the best examples are the shape-changing ghosts in the 19th century.
Yeah, let's go down this rabbit hole a little bit more. So the shape-changing ghost is something that interests me quite a lot, and I know you've talked about that more generally as well. So lots of these boggarts are these shape changers, and I think, and I might be wrong here, but I feel that a lot of what we refer to as black shuck generally, and a lot of these dogs, spirits throughout the 19th century, wider than Lancashire, are also this category where actually, if you go and look at the sources, they can appear as a donkey or a headless man or a headless woman and all these myriad shapes. And boggarts are certainly those, but they have a bit of a longer history than that, don't they, even?
Yeah, I mean, we have shape-changing accounts from Britain going back to the 1100s, and certainly they will have existed before. I think I just want to get something off my chest here, that for a few years I've been thinking about writing a book on shape-changing spirits in Britain, and I would love to write that book. The problem is it's really difficult to do, because what you have to start with is a deep dive and creating the biggest source file possible. And the issue with this is that shape changes, they just don't have a single term that describes them. In different parts of the country, and this is what, Graham, you anticipated a minute ago, in different parts of the country, they're described with different names and also sometimes in slightly different ways. But boggarts, the various shape changers in Lancashire, in northern Lincolnshire, in these areas, were definitely described as boggarts in the 19th century. And there is a book there crying out to be written.
Well, I definitely look forward to reading that if that happens, and I'm sure I'll nick some stories from that one if it does. Right, and on that then, actually, let's segue back into where my running order said we should be, more or less. You talk about compiling sources. So there's this image of a boggart in general culture that's different from how things actually were, and you've now got a lot of certainty that it wasn't like that, and you did a lot of work to get there, didn't you? Do you want to just talk maybe through the kind of work that you did and how you did it? Because I think it's actually quite a very interesting process how you've gone about that.
Right. So I just start perhaps here by saying that it was a very difficult process for me, and that I cut my teeth on Catherine Briggs, and I had this very strong idea of what a boggart was. And I just, perhaps this is an intellectual problem, perhaps it's a problem of intelligence or wisdom, but I just didn't want to let go of that idea. But as the sources mounted up, I just kept finding this idea, the initial idea I had contradicted. And so at a certain point, that beautiful moment where you just let go and you say, okay, let's pretend I'd never read Catherine Briggs. Let's pretend I'd never even been in the 20th century. Let's just take these sources at face value. And if you have 10,000 words on Boggarts, that's not enough. But if you can get, as I did, to about 250,000 words, then you're really in a good place, because then you just have all of these sources and you start to be able to block out the siren voices from later on that had their own certainties but didn't have that kind of a source file. And what I would say to anyone interested in researching the lower mythology of Britain is that, let's say, for the sake of argument, I don't know, that you want to study the Kelpie. So, how would you go about this? This is the protocol that I used with the boggart, and that in one way or the other, I've tried to adapt to other types of folklore beings. I think the first thing you do is you find a distinctive word, and then, so Kelpie works quite well like that. And then you just go through 5 or 6 databases and you get as many words as possible. And it is excruciating sometimes. It's certainly time consuming. I spent a couple of months. It took me 200 hours to go through every reference to the word mermaid in the British newspaper archive, for example. And it's just insane stuff sometimes. But this is what I think it brings you to another level, because when you've finished, you're absolutely knackered, of course, but you also have this source file. And what you've got to think is that source file that you have of Kelpies, after you've been through 5 or 6 hour archives for hours and hours, will be 10 times bigger than anyone else's archive. And at that point, you are in a better position than Catherine Briggs, because you have all this source material that the great Catherine didn't actually have, that she didn't have access to. And from there, you can really start to write the history of these beings in a way that prior to digitization, say 10, 15 years ago, just wasn't possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And interestingly, I'm pretty sure someone did that for Kelpies, because when I did my Kelpie episode, I did something very similar and found someone's article where they'd done exactly that, and I will drop their name here when I edit this in, because there's just, about 50, 60, 70 Kelpie stories all categorized up. And here's future me dropping that name in. It wasn't actually an article, it was a PhD I was referring to from 2002 by Order Labornia, and I actually massively understated the number of Kelpie tales she collects together. There were actually 309 in that PhD.
Because I'm doing a lot of mermaids at the moment, at the back of my mind, I thought, when I finish this bit, I'm going to have to spend a week on Kelpies. And so what you've said makes me very happy, because you've just saved the week of my life.
I'll drop you the link. So those sources that you've got, I think it's fair to say, having worked through your source book, most of them, or a vast majority of them, come from the press, don't they? That's where most of the boggart sources we've got come from. Is that true to say?
Instinctively, I would say that is true. And what you've got to think is that through the 19th century, there was a growing interest in folklore. So from about the 1820s, 1830s, you get the first little spikes of interest in folklore, and that grows. And then by the 1880s, 1890s, we have the Folklore Journal, the Folklore Society. But the great thing about newspapers is they're just there in the background all the time. And so even if there isn't interest in recording folklore in the local newspaper, there is interest in doing the story about the guy who had a crazy experience last night coming home after he'd been to the pub. And like you said, he met an exploding sheep that became a giant house that then became a burning wheel. And so stuff like this leaks into the press. And so even if there isn't a determination on the part of local writers to record folklore systematically, and normally there isn't, there is this incidental recording of folklore that just went unnoticed. And this is the stuff that people like Catherine Briggs were cut off from. Because, of course, Catherine Briggs could go to a British copyright library. She could sit down and she could order the 19th century journals and books, but she couldn't realistically go through the 19th century newspapers.
What I felt from going through the sources very much is that I often say on this podcast that 19th century folklorists are the reoccurring character. I'm in this, I cannot get away from them. I'm kind of beholden to their words unless I've got the odd medieval source where I'm very lucky. But mostly, whatever they wrote, I've got to use, even if I doubt its reality. But I think with Boggarts, I'm a storytelling podcast, this is what I do, but what I like to do is to take both accounts of encounters with the supernatural or just interesting little tidbits and turn them into stories. But with Boggarts in particular, the weighting away from narrative, structured stories towards accounts of actual experiences with these things. This has just happened to a guy last week and we're going to print it in the press now. It's very stark in terms of there aren't many, just this is a story, even though people talk about storytellers telling stories of Boggarts. It's a very common theme. Everyone gathered around the fireplace and will tell you the story of the Boggart. I do feel that those are real experiences, like I saw a ghost. Boggarts, more than possibly anything else I've encountered, there's a lot of those and very few narratives by comparison. Do you think that's fair to say?
Well, I've never seen that connection before, but you're in a privileged position to judge that. And I find it really interesting. And I suppose my gut response would be that we're depending a lot on these alternative sources that tend to bring out experiences. You know, the guy walking home from the pub and having this crazy encounter. Whereas there was a relative lack of interest in recording folklore in these areas compared to some others. I'd like to think about that more. I've got a sense that that's something important, but I'm not. Yeah, my guess would be it reflects a lack of recording folklore narratives, but quite that why that would be, I'm not sure. The other possibility, of course, is that folklore narratives tended to be recorded, they were less likely to be recorded under the name Boggart. That when someone was putting down a narrative, they would say, well, this is the story about Jenny Greenteeth, or this is the story that maybe Boggart was used less there. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. There was an image that you used at some point whereby literally for one southern newspaper, they just changed the word Boggart to ghost. Police chasing a Boggart or something, and that was a straight up substitution. That people clearly understood this was a northern word just for that, really.
Yeah, and you've got to think that in London, I mean, a London reader almost certainly wouldn't have understood the word boggart. So, in a sense, the local newspaper there was translating, and there were quite a few examples of that, where in northern newspapers there will be a title something like "Boggart Encountered" or "Boggart Seen." And by the time, if the story's dramatic enough and it's clipped into newspapers further to the south, the word is replaced typically by ghost.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what we haven't got as well. And one thing I was very sad to read when I was saying this to you before, but I'm from Liverpool originally, which is in the old county of Lancashire, certainly. And I was very sad to hear that there were basically no Boggart accounts from Liverpool, but that sounds like it's probably due to just those sources not surviving. Maybe it would have been there, but no one collecting.
I think just to give a sense of the full tragedy of this, that in the 19th century, two of Britain's great cities were Liverpool and Manchester. And these two cities were both in the historic county of Lancashire, and they were both rivals. Liverpool was one of the great sea cities of the world, one of the great coastal cities. Manchester, of course, was this economic powerhouse. And it's interesting how their identity grew up in two very different ways. Manchester intellectuals were fascinated by local history, and they were also very interested in folklore. And I would say, just off the top of my head, that 80% of the folklore we have for Lancashire is from what we would today call Greater Manchester. In other words, Merseyside and also the north of the old county of Lancashire, there's almost nothing. And Liverpool, on the other side, its intellectuals tended to be more interested in natural history, in science, in economics, in demographics, the more modern, more scientific side. And there, arguably, you have an identity, an unusual identity that comes through to the present with Liverpool. But you can bet that in the 19th century, there were no end of supernatural stories around Liverpool. It's just like you say, they weren't recorded for the most part, or they were recorded by chance.
Oh, well, that makes me feel better that there were some. And there are a lot today, which I will cover on an episode on in future. So have no fear of that anyway. On Boggarts, then, I really do have to ask you either story or particular Boggart. What is your favourite or favourites? What do you really enjoy?
Well, I love the encounters. I love not so much the normal narratives, entertaining as some of those are, but I love the frisson of a supernatural encounter, and I love asking myself what in God's name actually happened there. And it's particularly so when you have reliable sounding accounts. And I'm especially fascinated, come back to this theme again, but by shape changing. Because shape changing, I mean, if you came in today to my room and said, oh my God, I was walking down the street and I saw this cat that suddenly became as big as a house and then burst into flames. I mean, I would just, this is the stuff where I would get you sectioned. I mean, whereas if you said you saw a ghost, I might believe you, I might not, but I would not doubt your sincerity in terms of what you felt had happened. And these wonderful shape-changing stories that continue into the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and in different parts of the country, they even make it up to the Great War, and then they just vanish. And as you anticipated before, probably the way that shape changes survive in British folklore are the ABCs, the alien big cats, and the so-called black dogs that come after.
Yeah, and I think even though there's a lot of these stories that are clearly ridiculing the people, well, not necessarily ridiculing the people, but there's a lot of ridicule about Boggart beliefs. I didn't actually tell any of them, but quite a few of the stories that you found are people mistaking a donkey or their own shadow or goodness knows what else for a Boggart, and people taking the piss out of them for it, essentially, is a certain common trope, isn't it? So clearly there was a lot of people who thought this was a bit of nonsense, but at the same time, all these newspaper reports and something, people really did believe in these to some extent, didn't they?
Yeah, I think this is something that we have to be very careful about. And this is one of my hobby horses with folklore and the supernatural. I think too often looking back, particularly academics, which of course are a class all to themselves, but are liable to deny supernatural belief, to say, well, obviously it was just a metaphor, or you get this, for example, with many modern Irish scholars talking about 19th century fairy belief, that people didn't believe in fairies. It was just a symbol in society. So, and yet when you go back and look at these sources, there were clearly people who believed in fairies in Ireland, people who believed in boggarts in Lancashire. The million dollar question, of course, is what extent, what percentage of the population? And that's very, very difficult to judge. One thing that I would say is that I think supernatural belief isn't in that way like political beliefs say. I mean, if a politician, let's say the British Prime Minister, does something that you like or you don't like, there's a possibility that you may even vote differently. But most of us stay within about 20-30% of our politics right through our life. We're fairly stable in this respect. With the supernatural, though, things are different. It's not that we necessarily change our minds radically. It's that we are much more plastic with our supernatural beliefs. So, for example, if you were to ask me, Simon, do you believe in ghosts? I would probably say no, but I try and keep an open mind. But believe me, if I was walking down the right country lane at midnight and the right set of circumstances happened, I could very quickly experiment with ghost belief. And I think that's true of a lot of the population, that lots of people reject partially aspects of the supernatural, but when they actually come face to face with something they can't explain, all explanations are welcome. And I suspect that it was the same in the 19th century. And in fact, we get very good accounts, very reliable sounding accounts of people who have this kind of plastic belief. They're not really sure, but they did have this encounter. How can you explain that? And it's something that I relate to, and perhaps most people today relate to.
I see what you mean there, and certainly for myself, when I'm downstairs at night and there's an uncovered window, I know that feeling very well. On the same kind of area, I'd like to ask a question about, well, you talk about boggart flaps, where boggart, I'll let you talk about them, but seem very similar to other things that's happened where people really do get caught up in this idea of supernatural creatures, and yeah, just maybe talk a little bit about those.
Well, so I really love this because this is a moment where personal belief tips over and becomes social belief. And there are three ways this happens, and think of it as a stairwell going up. The first step is what I call a boggart flap. And a boggart flap is when people in a village say, oh, last night Biddy was walking home and she saw a 20-foot man. And then this morning, young Jonas was going to the factory and he saw a ghost cart going through a field that suddenly disappeared. And so people in the village begin to talk about the supernatural a lot. This is what I refer to as a boggart flap. And then the next level up is what I would call a boggart crowd. And this is where people have decided that the supernatural is taking place in a specific place. Very often a house on the edge of the village or the town. And you actually get crowds of people turning up to look. And for us, it's incredible because, most people would stay home and play with their Xbox preferably, or whatever it is the kids are doing today. But thousands, literally thousands of people would sometimes turn out in a Manchester suburb just to look at a curtain blowing in the wind in a house that was supposed to be a boggart. And then the third category, and in some ways the funnest of all, is the boggart hunt. And the boggart hunt is an attempt by the population to capture the boggart. And often in these cases, there's the idea, often a sensible idea, that the boggart is actually someone with a sheet over their head. So we have the boggart flap, which is the beginning, the boggart crowd, which is the consolidation of the flap, and the boggart hunt, which is, let's say, the boggart crowd activating itself. And what I should say straight away is I've referred to it to boggarts here, but this is true of all parts of Britain for various different supernatural beings. For example, there's an extraordinary mermaid crowd incident in Northern Ireland in the 1830s where hundreds of people from Belfast go to a small island because they've heard there's a mermaid in someone's bath there.
Wow.
And so you get incidents like this from all over the island. And again, it's these moments that you don't get in the folklore books, but where to some extent we have to take these people at face value. They clearly thought something was happening that was worth giving their attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I covered Glasgow a couple of episodes ago, and the hunt for the vampire with the iron teeth in 1954. But also in doing that, I found that it wasn't even that unusual. There were banshee hunts beforehand and all kinds of things just in Glasgow.
Lots.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
There were some really good cases of leprechaun hunts in Ireland where gangs of feral kids race around, County Clare or County Cavan because they've heard there's a leprechaun. And so there are many incidences. And of course, the classic one is the Liverpool, I think, is it the 60s, the Liverpool leprechauns?
So I think just to move away from that a little, and we've probably covered this somewhat, but I think I want to hammer it home a little bit. So all these boggarts in Lancashire, and called boggarts, or in this wider region that you call boggartdom, I think, are they fundamentally different from the kind of creatures we get elsewhere in the UK? Because there are lots of names that are similar-ish that seem to be applied elsewhere. I think you use dobies, and bogles is certainly one that I'm very familiar with, but a whole host of others. And apart from the name, and obviously the name is important, but is there anything fundamentally different, or is this just a whole category of beings that we kind of don't have anymore?
Okay, so I'll just return to what I said before, that boggart then is a generic label for any solitary bogey. And it's used in these areas I've already described. However, if you go to different parts of English-speaking Britain, and the rules perhaps are different in Welsh-speaking Wales and in the Scottish Highlands, you will find a similar category, though with different names. And so, for instance, in the Scottish lowlands, in the borders, in much of the northeast of England, in southern Lincolnshire, the word bogle was preferred to boggart. It was just the exact same meaning, but this was the word that was used. Another word that is used, as you say, is doby. Doby was used quite locally around what was the county of Westmoreland, so just to the north of Lancashire. And you have other words as you go further south into the Midlands. The word bogey was often used, probably the word that we're most familiar with. And then in standard English, you often in the 19th century have the word goblin being used. We think of goblin as being a little green fellow, not very nice. But goblin was just another generic word in the early 19th century. It was the word that was preferred in standard English. I would argue that in Cornwall, particularly Western Cornwall, the word pixie often comes close. We think of pixie as being fairy, and it usually is. But I think in Western Cornwall, that doesn't seem to work. In the North Riding of Yorkshire, my suspicion is, and I've never had the time to demonstrate this, and I could be wrong, is that barguest actually took on that meaning, this generic word. I'm not sure about that. And in parts of the northeast, also doby was used. I hope I'm giving you here a sense that you could almost do a useful folklore map of Britain where you put the generic term that was used in each given area, if that makes sense. And yeah, for me, they mean exactly the same thing. And we often see this in newspaper reports in just the same way that you were talking about a London newspaper translating boggart as ghost. You sometimes have newspapers translating boggart as bogle or bogey or doby. And there's one lovely example from a political meeting where a Liberal parliamentary candidate, these of course were the times of Liberal dominance in England, stood up and said, "We refer to them in my part of the world as bogles." And someone in the crowd in Manchester shouts back and says, "We call them boggarts." And that's it. It's perfect. There's a translation. That's what's going on. Now, there's a second part to what you're saying. Let's step away from the terms. I interpret the second part of your question as follows. Do solitary beings change their characteristics in different parts of Britain? I would say they do to some extent. And I think that becomes a very, very messy conversation. And it's one where, Graham, we need to talk again in a decade when I've got a bit more information. But I'll give you a crazy example of this, just as a provocation to you, to myself, to your listeners. In some parts of English-speaking Britain, shape changes tend to be, at base, dog-like. Mm-hmm. In other parts of English-speaking Britain, they tend at base to be horse-like. And these areas are exclusive. You could break down English-speaking Britain into shape changes based around dogs, shape changes based around horses, and then there's a third area, which is there is no special terminology for them. And I hope that just starts to give you a sense of how messy things are. And I wouldn't like to defend what I've just said in a duel, but I think you would, if you looked at this enough, you would start to be able to pick out patterns like that.
That is absolutely bizarre. I'm looking now at a copy of the Denham Tracts list of supernatural creatures, the 200-odd creatures, and just seeing how many of the names that you've said are on there. It's quite a few. Very interesting in terms of like how these words have then been more categorized up now. in a thing like a dictionary that needs categories, or an encyclopedia that needs to do that. It's kind of treating them more specifically and less general, like species.
But the big problem here is, and I hate to blame Catherine Briggs because I love Catherine Briggs, but what she did with the Dictionary of Fairies is she wrote a bestiary. You know, a bestiary, this is the medieval way of recording monsters. And the problem with a bestiary is it's flat. In other words, there's no taxonomy. It just says, okay, we have 900 different creatures. Here's a page. We have 900 pages, one page for each one and a pretty picture. And Catherine Briggs made the mistake, and she's not alone, but she was ground zero for modern folklore. She made the mistake of taking generic terms and more specific terms and just treating them as if they were all specific terms. And a lot of confusion in folklore comes from that mistake.
Yeah, I think I was thinking you were going to say there monster manual, because a lot of what I see online kind of misapprehension, people wanting a definition of all these different words in a way of a D&D monster manual where it's set out with all your stats and these are the rangers and you might have a big one and a small one, but apart from that's it, which obviously owes a hell of a lot to the old bestiaries. So yeah, that makes a hell of a lot of sense to me.
I think there's an argument. One of our great British folklorists, I think really our greatest living folklorist, is a man called Jeremy Hart, who I'm sure you've come across.
Very much so, yes.
Jeremy has a line in one of his articles where he says that Brian Froud and Alan Lee's book Fairies, wonderful book, very influential book, was basically Catherine Briggs's fairy dictionary drawn out. In other words, that Lee and Froud read the fairy dictionary, clapped their hands and off they went. And if you think of the D&D manuals going back to the glory days, I grew up in the late 70s and early 80s, I'd love to see the dates for the first Dungeons and Dragons Fiends Folio, but my suspicion is it comes out of that same genealogical tree of Catherine Briggs, Brian Froud, etc.
That makes a lot of sense. So go back and say it's really interesting what you're doing. I find it fascinating, and I kind of just can't wait to watch from the sidelines and see what it is you come up with next, because I feel there's just so many stories in there and so much stuff that people want to know about. Absolutely delighted to be able to take some of it and tell it to me. If that doesn't sound too mercenary of me, it's fascinating stuff, and I love to find all this out. I had someone messaged me today actually just saying was using the podcast just to find out about all this stuff that's so hard to find out, especially for England, actually, oddly in many ways compared to Wales, Scotland and Ireland, where there's a little bit more. I think especially in England it's been buried, and trying to uncover that is very difficult, I think.
Yeah, there are so many challenges left there. And what you say about England compared to the old Celtic speaking countries, I think is fascinating. But I'd also say within England, you have these even more dramatic gaps. So, for example, I'm from the West Riding, you're from Lancashire. These are areas that in the end will be able to get stuff. Well, in the end, if people dedicate themselves to this, we'll sort it out. There's enough material there in the 19th century. But the example I always use is Bedfordshire. Bedfordshire is this lovely, inoffensive little county to the north of the Thames. It's just outside the churn of London. And I have tried over the years to write the folklore of Bedfordshire as a kind of a challenge, because no one bothered. There were no folklorists in Bedfordshire. And so I've dragged every resource I can to bear. And I've got now a source file of about 100,000, 120,000 words. But it is, it's making stones bleed. It is very, very difficult. And so I think some of the big challenges won't be so much Lancashire and Yorkshire, but my goodness, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, I mean, even Kent, for instance, parts of southeastern England, the collection of folklore was just abysmal.
So if anyone's listening and wants to have a go, they should try and do that thing.
But really, and it will take thousands of hours from your life, but it is now doable.
And on that, actually, I think maybe to segue back into where I was intending to go originally, though it's brilliant we've gone all over as we have, is that a lot of the writings on boggarts from the 19th century, the ones that we've got, are obsessed with how the boggart is disappearing. And I think some of them, most of them, I would say, the majority, because of who they're written by, present this as a good thing, as progress and these ignorant rustics, and somewhere in between, with a few being a bit sad that it's going. And that change, that disappearance of the boggart, is very much what they're writing about, and some of them want to preserve that, or some of them are just noting, and some of them are happy about it. As you say, the First World War or so, by that point the boggart is broadly disappearing and becoming replaced by this new thing. However, the second part of, I think, what you've done is shown that maybe it went on a bit later than that, and so I just wonder whether you might want to talk about the last years of the boggart, and if even there's any boggarts of the old variety left.
Yeah, so when I think of my book on the boggart, perhaps the chapter that I'm proudest of is the chapter on boggart survival, because I came to that with very, very few sources. Very few people had written about it. And so I recognised that I was going to have to just really, in the best possible sense, invent my own sources, not literally make them up, but go out and find them, dig them up. And so what I started to do was to speak to people, or write to people who lived in the areas where boggart had been used as a name. And I said that I didn't want to speak or write to anyone who was born after 1980, I think was my cutoff date. So I was interested in people who were born in 79 or before. And I just said, do you know, you live in, let's say, Liverpool, or you live in Lancaster, or you live in one of the Derbyshire mill towns. Does the name boggart mean anything to you? And in the end, I was able to gather in overwhelmingly, with the help of social media. I wouldn't have been able to do this without social media. About 1,000 replies. And my memory is, I hope I've got the numbers right here, that about 200, was it 300 people just said, no, I grew up in this town, but I've never heard the word boggart. But other people did remember it. And there it was. I found it very moving, because you could see that this word was dying out in most of the places I was looking at. But people would say, I've not heard that word for years, but my grandma used to say it. And sometimes they would give a partial or even a slightly mistaken explanation of what it meant. And I just found this very moving and very charming. But what absolutely blew me away, and the biggest surprise I had with that book, and really perhaps the biggest surprise I've had as a folklorist since I began writing about British folklore, is that there were some areas, particularly in the Northwest, where the word boggart survived with the traditional meaning. Now, so there was lots of Catherine Briggs-like interference, where people wanted boggarts to be house spirits. But I remember one woman from northern Lancashire saying, she was writing about Jenny Greenteeth, and she said, I know that this is wrong, because she'd read Catherine Briggs, but I think my parents used to say that Jenny Greenteeth was a boggart. And of course, by the Catherine Briggs definition, this is just insane, but that is exactly what happened in the 19th century. So in the 1980s, on her farm in the Fylde, she had absolutely grown up with the traditional terms. And there she was, looking back at the history of her family. But the place where arguably the boggart seems to have survived best of all as a dialect term was in Peak District in Derbyshire, where in the villages there, people absolutely knew what a boggart was, and they used it in the traditional sense. And I was astounded by this. I mean, just astounded. I found it really, really surprising, and again, really moving, that this word, against all the odds, against the best efforts of modernity, railway, school teachers, Baden Powell, Catherine Briggs, this word had survived in these little villages to mean an ambivalent, solitary, supernatural being.
You wouldn't have gone looking there specifically either. So
No.
that's absolutely fascinating.
And it's one of these sad things where, of course, I was speaking to older people a lot of the time. And really, if I had limitless resources, and I should just go on the record here and say I have anything but limitless resources, as many people who study folklore. But if I had limitless resources, I would set up 4 or 5 young researchers and I would just blitz those towns and go and have face to face interviews with as many people as I could from those towns. Because it's an old fashioned word, but they're bastions of a tradition that I thought had vanished in the 1890s.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting with the whole term boggart. There's this little moment where you see it, but it clearly exists before and after then as well, carried on by some people and before anyone paid any attention beforehand. And so
Yeah.
you just get a little window onto what it was. I feel that I should ask you about Boggart Hole Clough, because I didn't discuss it on the episode because I did an earlier episode on it, but it feels important in terms of the history of Boggarts generally, and I know you've done some work around there.
Yeah, I think Boggart Hole Clough is to some extent the exception that proves the rules with the exception that proves the rule with Boggarts. The thing about Boggart Hole Clough is that, of course, this is a park in northern Greater Manchester. It's now completely surrounded by the conurbation, but it is a place with an atmosphere. It's well worth visiting if you get a chance. What's fascinating about Boggart Hole Clough is, first of all, that this is the one area in the Manchester conurbation where it's become a point of reference for people as far as boggarts go. So when people say what's a boggart, they'll know about Boggart Hole Clough. And there are generations of kids, including today, who go to Boggart Hole Clough. And there is a local mythology, a local folklore about the boggarts, very important, plural, that live in Boggart Hole Clough. And there's this idea that there's this almost little tribe of black or green small reptilian beings, what we would think of as goblins, and that register, I think, more as being mischievous than being evil. And here, this is the one example, I think, where the Briggsian version of the boggart has basically caught on. And it's not just something that's talked about by people interested in folklore, it's become part of the community's folklore. There are kids in those, in Blackley who won't sleep tonight because they're scared of the boggarts in Boggart Hole Clough. And so I always pay tribute to the way that the supernatural changes. I always say it's healthy. But there you have an example where really a new version of the boggart has put down roots and has caught on.
Outside of Boggart Hole Clough, do you think the boggart has a future? And especially, I suppose, do you think this old kind of boggart has a future? If it does, I'm sure it'd be through the work that you've done. Or do you think there's future in these other kind of boggarts as well?
I don't think it really does have a future, and this is part of the curse of being a historian. But things change, and we just have to accept that they change. And I'm afraid that boggarts are on their way out. And in a sense, what you see in Boggart Hole Clough is, part of me is a little bit annoyed by it because it's not the traditional boggart that I love from the 19th century. But the wiser part of me recognises, no, this is good, because here the supernatural is reinventing itself, and we need the supernatural, I think, in our lives. I don't care if you're a New Age or Richard Dawkins. I mean, I think the supernatural is part of how we function as human beings. It seems to have important part in our personal lives and our social lives. And in this way, it's absolutely natural that these things are reinvented. But yeah, I think the traditional boggart is gone. And when you look back at this period I've been talking about, I think if you want to study this, if let's say you're from Northamptonshire and you want to go looking for the old folklore, what we call the prior folklore, I think you have to ask yourself two questions. You need to find the period when people still believed, at least to some extent, and you need to find the period when there are the best sources. Now, the dream would be to go back in a time machine to the 1600s, but it's not going to happen. And so, though in the 1900s prior folklore was already under attack, it had already disappeared in many places, the fairy faith had almost been wiped out in much of southern England, it is the sweet spot where we combine the survival of traditional belief with immense numbers of sources. And so it's wonderful if we go back to the 1700s or the 1600s, but really it's the 1800s that we have to really concentrate our efforts on.
I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of any more of these folklore studies, which is a surprisingly live field, which I think is something that's odd. There's lots of books coming out now, like your own, and new stuff all the time, which is great, actually. It's absolutely wonderful that there are so much of this stuff that's only being uncovered now. So the Victorians didn't do it all.
No, we've still got a lot to do. I was looking, I'm an editor for a book series at Exeter University Press on folklore, and I was looking at the books for the summer that are coming out in this series. And I was just thinking how maybe we can actually start to talk of a renaissance in British folklore. The last renaissance in British folklore came under that wonderful person, Catherine Briggs, who we've talked about a few times, and who, despite all my slight sniping about, is a goddess, the grand dame of British folklore. And she ushered in an amazing generation of folklorists, people of real quality and real ability. And to some extent, the last 20, 30 years have been a little bit quieter. And I think that things are coming up to the boil again. I was thinking about this today. I really do think if we talk in 10 years, we'll see that quite a few important books and studies come out.
Done live shows recently and just saying, oh, we're having a night, we're going to do some folklore, talk about folk tales and folklore, and people love it. They come along, and I think I'm not alone. So many, just lots and lots of interest at the minute because, well, as you said before, actually, the supernatural and all that goes with it is a big part of our lives, and I think people love attacking it from lots of different angles, the storytellers and the artists and the people doing the actual work, the historians like yourself, and there's just so many different angles and different things people can take from it. So I think we've just about reached the end there. Thank you so much for this. It's been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate you doing this, and hopefully everyone who's listening has enjoyed it. I hope so. Getting an expert discussion section.
Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking, Graham, to you, and thank you for being so patient with my heretical views on Boggarts. So,
well, on that, you can believe me or not, but I've been reading 19th century sources for many years before I did this podcast as an interest, I suppose, and that's why I did it, to some reason to do it. And I think it was accounts from Leeds that refer to Boggarts, and there was lots about Padfoot and being almost the same thing. And I remember then, even though that's outside the area, thinking, this is odd. And I remember that, and Boggarts have been a real big interest of mine for basically since that. And I knew something was up, and I think obviously didn't think about it in the same way you did, but I did know it was kind of wrong, and it was really interesting when I came across your work and then could see it. So no, it's been absolutely great to have all that kind of confirmed and explained. One last thing before you go is, of course, to give you an opportunity to talk about what you've got coming up. I know you're probably working on a lot of different things. And we haven't even mentioned your own podcast, which we should definitely do. So let us know what you're working on now and where we can find you if we want more. I'll obviously be doing links all over the place on the website, but give us a flavour.
Really quickly, I'm now 50. I hope to have 20 years of life left if AI and various other things don't wipe us out in the meantime. And my hope in those 20 years is to carry to fruition two huge projects. The first is I really want to write a definitive guide to the fairies of England in the 19th century. This is the great labour of love I want to carry forward. Fairies are my first love. I'm sorry, Boggarts, but I love to do the fairies. The other big task I want to do is to create an atlas of the British supernatural, because I think so much of the confusion starts to be cleared up when we look at maps. And I'll give you a crazy example of this. If you go to Catherine Briggs's dictionary and you look under Skriker, Padfoot, Barguest, there's another one, of course, that I'm forgetting just to the south. Padfoot. Guy Trash, of course. And if you look at those, she gives a different definition for each one. If you put them on a map, there is no overlapping. They tightly interlink. In other words, these are different terms for the same supernatural being. And so in doing a supernatural atlas, I hope to clear up a lot of these ambiguities. And then as far as where to find me, I have with Chris Woodyard a podcast called Boggart and Banshee, and we do that about once a month, and we talk about different episodes or different types of the supernatural there, and more often than not we argue, and Chris usually gets the better of me. But I like to think it's entertaining. Certainly I learn a lot from Chris, who has immense knowledge. And then the other thing, we have a Facebook page connected with Boggart and Banshee where we post every day. And then very gently in the last month or so, I've been starting to use Twitter a bit more. I find particularly when I'm doing just hours of research, it's quite a nice break to post weird and special things I find. And so if you look for me under Dr. Beachcombing on Twitter, particularly during periods where I'm researching, I just put the stuff up as it's coming out. So that might be a way to find me there.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I listen to your podcast and really enjoy it. And I see the little things on social media as well, and some of them are absolutely fascinating and hilarious as well. So I'll stick a link to those on my website as well. So I think that's about it then. Thank you so much. And good luck with all of that. I like the idea of a 20-year plan. I commend you on having that level of organisation to your life, but it's a project that sounds absolutely wonderful. So I wish you all the best of it, and I'm sure I'll be hearing lots more from you. So thank you very much.
Graham, thank you. It's been brilliant to talk tonight. I really enjoyed it.
And there you go. I really hope you enjoyed that. I kind of think if you're still listening to this, you probably did. I know I really did. And now, to finally finish off the whole boggart part of the podcast, I'm going to tell my version of the story that Simon Young talked about. That one that was included in John Roby's Legends of Lancashire, supplied by Croft and Croker, and which was almost certainly a copy of a story which had nothing to do with boggarts. It did not come from Lancashire or boggartdom anywhere, in fact, and yet, despite that, this story has become the legacy of boggarts. Now, for this story, we are in Boggart Hole Clough, the most boggart-famed place of all. If you want a more folkloric story set there, then go back to listen to my Manchester episodes. But if not, then let's start the story of the boggart. It was named Boggart Hole Clough even before the Cheetham family took up residence there. George Cheetham's background is shrouded in mystery, but not, I feel, a mystery that will be of any interest to solve. It is simply the case that in some way or other he and his family, children, wife, the usual, they came into possession of the farm whose fields bordered Boggart Hole Clough, bringing with them farm labourers and domestics and the like that accompanied even a moderate amount of wealth in those days and which have very little narrative agency of their own. Perhaps it is the case that he even constructed the farm himself, and if he did, then he had chosen a very poor spot indeed. Strange laughter was the first hint that something was wrong in the house, a pretty big hint at that. It was sometimes so faint you'd find yourself questioning if you'd imagined you'd really heard it. But at other times it echoed through multiple rooms at once and filled the whole place up. Then there were the things left out of place, moved to where they should not be, from the barns to the farmhouse to the barns and back again. Noises, clattering and knocking together of pots and pans and cutlery from empty rooms. and at times the horses in the stables started up with terrified neighs and whinnies in the middle of the night. All these minor disturbances went on week after week, so that eventually they began to appear almost ordinary, and after a while the initial terror that they provoked in the family and servants alike somewhat abated through constant exposure. So much so that when a shrill laugh came from somewhere above him one winter's eve, Robert, the youngest son of the family, started just a little, but then caught himself. "It's just the boggart," he said. And then he said out loud, "Oh, boggart, what a little tyke you are! I bet if I just caught a glimpse of you, you'd be all adorable." And I imagine the boy kind of squeezing the little boggart cheeks like an over-enthusiastic grandparent with a chubby baby. And at the words, "You little tyke," the boggart went very silent. And young Robert thought nothing more of it. That evening he was asleep in bed with his brother John, which, yes, children, and indeed many adults not in relationships, shared beds back then. Even the well-off ones, it is not a thing. And the room was in total darkness. The two lads were sleeping peacefully until there came a shrill voice. "Little tyke, you're a little tyke." Great comeback there, boggart. That was followed by a supernatural shrieking that had both boys sitting stark upright, but not for long, as young Rob was seized by the feet and pulled down to the very bottom of the bed, so the young lad's feet were for an instant level with his elder brother's. But just for an instant, as then hands unseen that could somehow hold his head at the same time as his feet, pulled him up to the very top of the bed, and then back down again. "Short and long won't match," came the cry of the boggart, as again Robert was pulled down so his feet were level and then up again, and so on and so forth, all the while the manic cry of "Short and long won't match." Hilarious, great sense of humour, this boggart. Rob's terrified brother John just lay there shaking in terror as the boggart continued its impossible matching game on and on until cockcrow. When their father discovered the two boys the next morning, they were paralysed with fear still. Now, George Cheetham apparently did not have the recourse to the kind of human agents to fight the supernatural we are so well acquainted with on this podcast. No cunning people or priests here. But he had a little bit of a plan. What he would do was he would move the boys' bedroom from the house to the still expansive cart house just across the way. The boggart could have the room. Maybe it was the house that was the problem. And for a while this seemed to do the trick. The children slept well. The boggart could sometimes be heard inside their old room, but that was a price worth paying. However, the peace did not last. Quite likely, by making the boggart a kind of official lodger, giving it its own space, the boggart had learned the wrong lesson. You know, this is pretty much exactly the kind of thing that, had he been there, Cesar Millan would have warned the farmer against. Because now the boggart saw its bad behaviour as being rewarded. It had moved up the pecking order. It might not have come directly for Robert again, but the young boy wasn't going to cause it a tyke any time soon. However, the boggart did appear almost everywhere else. Well, I say appear, its actions did. It was never actually visible. It would take bread and butter straight from the table, or even from the hand. Not showing its face, but you'd just be buttering up a lovely slice, reaching up about to take a bite, and it would be whisked away, chucked across the room to land butter down on the floor. Now, rather than the crockery being moved around a bit, it would be simply smashed, along with the milk. Chairs were upended, doors swung open violently, curtains pulled down in the night, and that horrible little laugh was heard time and time again. The nights were the worst, when dreadful, near diabolical screams and shrieks would echo around the house. The sleep of everyone was disturbed, and as more and more became broken, the boggart's pranks, can you hear the air quotes there, they became more of a genuine danger to life and limb. Eventually, it became too much. George and his wife made a plan. Plan they did not want to have to make, but one they needed to. They would leave, get another house somehow, rent at first if they had to. But they would do it, whatever it cost them. Nothing could be as bad as this. They had to leave. They intended to plan it all out carefully, to have everything set in place, but one morning, after a long, sleepless night, and with the floor covered in the bones of crockery smashed, George and his unnamed wife, they snapped, and suddenly, possessed of a great deal of energy, working alongside those few servants who had not fled, they packed up all their clothes and their belongings, what crockery and furniture remained, brought out vast chests and piled all that they could on a great cart, telling themselves they'd come back for the rest, even though they knew they probably wouldn't. And off the whole family went on the cart, finally fleeing the monstrous boggart that had tormented them so. They were a little way down the dirt road when this great procession encountered a neighbour. "You're finally leaving that boggart house, then?" the neighbour asked George, who opened his mouth to give an answer. And as he did so, from somewhere in the back of the cart, from under the furniture and amongst the chests, there came that shrill little voice. "Aye, we're leaving. Going to find somewhere new," said the boggart. And I assume at this point, the family broke down in tears. The real ending to the story is basically there, but storytellers can choose to top it off how they feel. If I think about this too much, it really is a dark and awful ending. There is no escape from the creature. This is akin to every horror film that has a supernatural being that you just cannot stop. A la It Follows, or The Ring, or, if you're of a certain internet age, the horribly slow murderer with the extremely inefficient weapon. The boggart is with you now, and it will go wherever you go. There is no escape, which is a fairly terrifying idea. Other storytellers can choose to play this for laughs. "Ha-ha, the boggart's gonna come along with them. They thought they were leaving, but that cheeky chappie's still here." The whole tale itself becomes a punchline. A halfway house between just really leaning into the existential dread and just laughing it off is what Crofton Croker does in his telling of this story. Tag on a tiny epilogue that the sceptical, pessimistic doomsayers like myself may question the veracity of, but which is nevertheless a part of the story, so it's definitely what happened. Because apparently, after the defeated family turned back to the house, they may as well stay somewhere they knew rather than off somewhere else if the boggart was going with them. Well then, the boggart, having, quote, ascertained the insecurity of his tenure, unquote, and while he never left, the quiet of the family was, to a large extent, restored. The end. And that is it, the story that started the change of the boggart from the lone supernatural figure, particularly the ghost, into the goblin it is today. Now, you may notice that story doesn't actually have a goblin-y boggart in it, but it was illustrated with a picture of one originally, and the kind of tricks described in this don't feel very ghostly, and perhaps even more important, subsequent publications that told this story have continued with the picture of the goblin-y boggart. So, that's it. Boggarts are over for now. I can't promise we won't come back to them in some manner in the future. I hope you've enjoyed these couple of episodes, especially this one with Dr. Simon Young. Another massive thanks to him for doing this. Please tell me if you do or indeed do not want more of this. I really enjoyed talking to him, but I want to know what you think. I'm not going to do new patron shouts out on this episode, simply because I know people might not have listened here because it's not the usual format, so I will do those next time, but a massive thanks to the patrons in general for allowing me to commission pictures of folklore-accurate boggarts. And now we're past the 50th. I'm going to crack on for 100 episodes, with no promise when those will be released, but I'd really love to do it. So, next episode, I'm pretty sure, even though I've just done a multi-story episode, I'm feeling like one again because I found a very unusual and unexpected framing narrative. So we're going to cover giants and revisit a character who I genuinely believed would never come back to this podcast. And I can't wait to do that. Thank you all so much for listening. That's been Tales of Britain and Ireland Expert Discussion Section. I'll see you next time. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman. And you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.